Thank you, everyone, and welcome. My name is David Cobb. I'm one of the organizers of the Socialist Night School. My pronouns are he and him. The Metro DC TSA Socialist Night School is a series of sessions that explore basic ideas, concepts, historical, and current events related to socialism. While everyone is welcome, these sessions are especially designed to those who are newer to socialism, to TSA, and to the topics covered. Our night school was started based on the notion that our organizing and our political education are not properly understood in tension, but rather are mutually reinforcing. For those of you who joined us before, you know that trying to understand the world beyond the United States has been a focus for us because capitalism is global, so therefore our socialism must be global because we have a world to win, not just a country to reform. I'm particularly excited tonight because of our special guests, because of the importance and the timeliness of the topic, and because this is our first time back after some time off, and I'm hoping tonight is going to be the first step to more regular sessions, hopefully here as well. So next I'm going to turn it over to our presenters, Sabrina and Andre, to introduce themselves and to get the conversation started.
That's great. Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. People who are here and also people who are online. My name is Fernandes. I'm a Brazilian sociologist, eco-socialist organizer, also online communicator, so I do a lot of projects for political education online, mostly in Portuguese, but we also have subtitles in English and Spanish in a bunch of videos. So I have this project called Tese 11, Thesis 11, that works through this. I'm contributing editor at Jacobin magazine, I think for 6 years now. Was editor-in-chief for Jacobin Brazil, and I just finished a postdoctoral fellowship with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, 3 years. So it's actually my first week of the fellowship, and so it's good to have finished that. Primarily because the main focus of this fellowship was understanding the role of Bolsonaro and the destruction of nature in Latin America. So I think it was good riddance that, like I just finished the fellowship and Bolsonaro lost the election, so we're done with that cycle.
That's right. So thank you guys for you all for being here. My name is Pagliarini. I'm a professor of history at a very small college in Central Virginia called Hampton-Sydney College, which is, as I say, it's very small. No one's ever heard of it, but it is the 10th oldest college in the United States, so they're very proud of that history. James Madison, for example, was on the founding board. William Henry Harrison went there, so it's very much an interesting place to be at this moment in the country's politics. Very conservative student body, and I'm very much not that. So it's just an interesting place to be. I grew up in Brazil. I write about Brazil. My scholarship is on the Cold War in Latin America, especially Brazil. I've written a lot for academic audiences, but also sort of general audiences. Sabrina has edited pieces of mine for Jacobin Brazil, Jacobin US. I had a piece, in The Guardian, in New Republic a lot. So, I've kind of carved out a little space for myself as a historian, but as someone who writes and thinks about Brazil a lot. I was there this past summer, and I'll be there next summer on a Fulbright. So kind of back and forth. And I have learned a lot about, particularly sort of economic questions under Bolsonaro, but even under left-wing governments and the ways in which left-wing governments have fallen short through Sabrina's work. So who I've been following for like a decade now, almost maybe not quite a decade, but on social media. And I always joke with her that she's on my sort of eco-socialist Mount Rushmore, right? One of these icons. So I'm really happy to be doing this event. Really grateful to David for putting it together. And thank you all for being here. And I think we imagine this being kind of a conversation, free-flowing, so we can have questions and hopefully just have a chat. But maybe I'll let Sabrina go first and talk about maybe how you see where we are, and then I'll respond, and then back and forth, and so on. Cool?
Yeah. Okay. Let's try to keep this a little bit more informal. But in general, when we decided to do this little thing, we were hoping that was after the elections in Brazil, hopefully we'll be like under this feeling of relief, which we are. But we also want to present some of the challenges, what's coming next, and how hard it was for us to get here. So to give a little bit of a background, I have to go back 10 years ago. So June 2013 was a very important moment in recent Brazilian history when we had these massive protests, people taking to the streets. Part of this was sort of connected to how people would think of Occupy or the Arab Spring. So because it was horizontal, but also very influx You couldn't tell leadership, but the organized left was involved, but the people were mostly not connected to any organizations, and there was a general feeling of a crisis of representation, that no party represents me, and this government in power doesn't represent me either, and I don't really see myself in politics, but I want better healthcare, better education, I want the streets to be safer, things like that. What happens with this type of demands, and this is what I worked through like most of my PhD with this, is that they're very easy for you to just empty them out, because you have these important like terms. Yes, like everyone must be healthy in general, right? But how you actually achieve that, it changes according to a political project. And the fact is that the Brazilian left at the time is a very fragmented left. So we have, actually in the entire country, have over 30 political parties. And then when you count the left, we have like just under about 10 parties. And they're going to go to like the most moderate to the very like radical Stalinist parties, right? And well, they don't get along that well, besides when you're just dealing with some institutional things when one of the leftist parties is in government. And the one leftist party that has occupied federal government in Brazil is the Workers' Party, or the PT, we refer to it as the PT, and right now Lula got elected for the third time president of Brazil through the Workers' Party. The thing is that in June 2013, the Workers' Party was in power, Dilma Rousseff was president, and they were not able to really capture this feeling of dissatisfaction from the crowds and give them something that they could think, okay, yes, no, we're gonna go in this direction. The Brazilian right was able to take better advantage of this. Part of this also connected to even organizations here from the US, for example, Students for Liberty. So these what would be like the US alt-right is connected to the Brazilian alt-right as well. And you had new movements pop up, like the Brazilian, like the Free Brazil movement, like the MBL, and like younger leadership, and they pushed for the coup of Dilma Rousseff after she got reelected. So we had this coup in 2016. There was like this impeachment process filled with bogus charges. In fact, the things that she was accused of, they were actually legalized officially later on. Right after. And then from that you had the persecution of Lula. So there was a car wash investigation. We published tons of things about this investigation on Jacobin before. And you can tell from here there's a big crisis, big political crisis. And this is perfect for someone like Bolsonaro to just come in and sweep in and say, I'm anti-systemic. I'm nothing like these other people here. And Bolsonaro had been around for a while. I'll let André talk a little bit more about that. But the thing is that moment is what pushed Bolsonaro forward, because it gave him an opportunity to fill up this vacuum in Brazilian politics with people who were looking for an answer, but also not a very hard answer that required you to organize and fight for your rights. Like you just wanted someone else to come in and fix the problems. And one of the main aspects here was the struggle around corruption. What is corruption? And Bolsonaro put himself as anti-systemic and anti-corruption in those terms.
Yeah, so Bolsonaro, I mean, I think one of the things in this country that we hear him talked about, Trump of the tropics, right, as part of this broader right-wing wave. And for reasons that Sabrina was just describing, and I'll talk about a little bit too, that's always been, I think, a slightly unsatisfying framing, in part because the forces, the context from which Bolsonaro emerges, very different than the context in which Trump emerges. Not least because, as Sabrina was saying, the sort of the immediate years leading up to Bolsonaro's election, right, of the 2013, the sort of mass, occupation of the street, Dilma's sort of kind of crazy impeachment. We can talk more about that maybe in Q&A, because there's, in a way, I think the country, Lula's election might be this kind of coming to terms with what was a really unjust process with his successor. But to me, one of the biggest reasons that comparison doesn't always work of Lula and Trump, of Bolsonaro and Trump, is that Bolsonaro has a very particular sort of formation in the armed forces, and that really sets him apart from Trump. And so to understand that aspect of his appeal, we really have to understand some recent Brazilian history too. From 1964 to 1985, Brazil was ruled by a military dictatorship. That was, maybe I'm biased because it's what I work on, but it's like the quintessential sort of anti-communist, post-Cuban Revolution, military intervention that says the largest country in Latin America, what is today the world's fourth largest democracy, cannot be allowed to go the way of Cuba. It cannot be allowed under any circumstance to become a communist country. And there are Kennedy officials in the Kennedy administration who are saying it's one thing to lose Cuba, as if it's the United States is to lose. It would be another thing to lose Brazil. And so the stage was set in the 60s for a real, almost apocalyptic struggle between these kind of big associations of left and right. Even though the president at the time, who is denounced by the right as a sort of proto-communist, or either soft on communism, or a communist, or too weak in the communist. He's either dumb or he's complicit. This was the argument about Jair Bolsonaro, the president at the time. And so the military intervenes in 1964. Now, from 64 to 85, there are more or less differences within the armed forces about sort of how far to take this project. And I think it's safe to say that Bolsonaro, even though he's of a younger generation, he serves in the late 70s and the early 80s, represents a line within the armed forces that says basically that the dictatorship didn't go far enough. Right? To this day, Bolsonaro faults the dictatorship for not killing enough people, for not torturing enough people, for not having gone far enough. And I think that's just it's a much different sort of lineage ideologically and politically than anything Trump represents. This is why with this year's election there was a lot of concern about sort of what is Bolsonaro sort of planning. I'm sure we've all read articles about his election denial. There was a real concern about I would say less the armed forces themselves, but more so police forces in Brazil. So in Brazil, the police are organized at the state level in sort of military terms. They're called Polícia Militar, military police. And there have been several instances over the course of his administration, which he's elected in 2018, of really disturbing incidences of police forces openly supporting the president's agenda, the president himself. And so if things sort of reached a boiling point between Lula and Bolsonaro, what is the police going to do? And we can say a little more about what happened on election day, but what ended up happening was the federal highway police. There are all kinds of reports of trying to intervene in people getting to the polls, especially in parts of the country most likely to vote for Lula, to try to reduce that margin. And so one of the things Sabrina and I were talking about before this was how do we understand the result? Lula wins with just about 60 million votes. Bolsonaro with about 58 million, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 57, 58, somewhere in that range. And, considering this history of Bolsonaro, fundamentally anti-democratic, authoritarian, just uncommitted, I think it's fair to say, with the democratic culture that was established in Brazil after the dictatorship, versus someone like Lula who comes out of the union movement, who helped to build a party from scratch, Latin America's largest mass-based party, that this would be a kind of an epic showdown. And so how do we understand the results in that context? Should we be impressed, we were talking about this before, should we be impressed that it was that close? That, given where Lula was in recent years, he served a year and a half in prison as a result of this corruption kind of haze that took over Brazil in recent years. Coming back to win an unprecedented third term against a president who was in office. No incumbent president has ever lost re-election in Brazil. So, is that impressive? I mean, I think it's indisputably impressive. But also the fact that Bolsonaro presided over the government that he did, this disastrous administration, a calamitous COVID-19 handling, right? I mean, just a barrage of international outrage about the deforestation of the Amazon, for example, and yet, he got it pretty close. He got within a couple million votes, 2 million votes, something like that. So one of the things I think, at least I'm still kind of thinking about, is how do we understand that result? And I know that's something that you think about that too, or whatever.
Yeah, there's been a conversation over the past years of whether like is Bolsonaro incompetent. You see, like so, and like the terms in Brazilian debates, like is he incompetent? Is he stupid? Like what is he doing? He has no idea what he's doing. We've tried to make a point that Bolsonaro came into power with a project, and he was able to execute most of it in terms of just depleting the resources out of public services, dismantling entire institutions. So, for example, he arrived and started cutting the budget for social spending, for spending on climate, and he started putting other people into government. So we actually got news just very recently that Lula has committed basically to purging the military personnel out of the civilian posts within the government, because what Bolsonaro did over the past 4 years is to put military personnel in civilian posts within the government, and now you need to get these people out because they're there to do Bolsonaro's bidding. So Bolsonaro comes in and he's able to actually get a lot of stuff done. And one of the reasons that people usually say, well, he must be stupid. He doesn't know what he's doing, is because, well, when he speaks, he does say like the darndest things. Right? There's that, and there's the whole situation with the fact that there are some hiccups, right, along the way when they're trying to do certain things in government. But when you have like a change in ministries, the way that we had in the past years, like we had like constant change in ministries coming from Bolsonaro, because they had internal conflicts about how far can you take this? How far can you take this? So Bolsonaro gets elected through a coalition. It is a coalition that wanted to get the BT out, but it's a coalition that goes from like center-right liberals, like so people who even see themselves as sort of progressive. No, I'm pro LGBTQ.
Anti-corruption.
Yeah, like they see themselves as sort of progressive, but they don't want the left anymore because they're interested in the austerity project out of it. So they come along and then they start having some conflicts because Bolsonaro is always saying homophobic things, and because he's saying anti-Semitic things, and because, well, there's a rise in Nazi cells in the country. So that creates conflict. The fact that he's not able to deliver as much in terms of economic growth as he was hoped for. And then there's a disaster with the pandemic, that is this idea of like actually treating part of the country as a laboratory for herd immunity. And the state of Amazonas with the capital Manaus is one of the biggest cases for it. We have documentation that this is what the government was trying to prove. And of course, this is where we got variants and lots of people killed. And we end up with the second highest death toll of the pandemic, so just after you guys over here in the US, unfortunately. So this is a really, really bad situation, and then more people start like jumping ship. So maybe like we can't be with Bolsonaro. And then we thought that once Lula is able to, through fighting in the courts, to actually like prove that the processes, like the judicial processes against him, they were very biased, coming from this one judge that was persecuting him directly, and then ended up as Justice Minister of Bolsonaro, so creating a direct linkage. Like you get rid of the guy who's posited to win, and then you become Justice Minister. They have an internal fight, so this judge gets out of the government, but then now during the elections he comes back in with Bolsonaro again. So it comes full circle. So we have all of this, and Lula is able to come back in, and he's doing quite well in the polls. He's right there, like always in first place in the polling. But it got to a point where when we were looking at numbers, well, there's a margin, because we saw that in the past years, whenever there was polling, like public opinion polling, like of the approval rate of Bolsonaro, the approval rate would be about 30%. And then you would have like a wide range of, disapproval levels within the other 70%. So that gave people the idea that even though we weren't able to mobilize an impeachment against Bolsonaro, because Bolsonaro got his allies in Congress like really well, including like they bought them with special budget issues and things like that too. We would be able to get rid of him now through the ballot box, and then things end up much closer than everyone expected. There's not a single soul that I know like who was following Brazilian politics that thought it would have been this close in the first round. because all of the polling numbers always kept like a wider margin, to the point that we thought maybe Lula could have won in the first round directly. We wouldn't have to go to a second round. And this was quite surprising because we were following those numbers. But when we look ideologically, it points us to some of the things that connect to what Andrea was saying here. For example, anti-communism. A lot of these people who are like, okay, I can't have Lula at all. Why? Because Lula is a communist. Lula is by no means a communist. We're talking about someone who has he, way in the past, we actually even published one of like his old speeches on socialism, but way in the past, Lula was a lot more radical than he is today. He became, obviously, probably the most skilled politician in Brazilian history. Very, very natural leader. But he became really pro this idea of like class conciliation. Like, I need to give everyone a little bit so we can make peace, and then the country can grow, and then we can lift people out of poverty in that manner. So he ended up being quite moderate, and he even gave more class power to people that shouldn't have had this much class power, because then they used this class power against the PT, right? To get rid of Dilma. Because, you know, the pie was shrinking, economic crisis, so you use that, and then you play on people's resentment. Because one of the things about social mobility in the country, when Lula is lifting, like with these policies and the social movements alone fighting with it, like he's not God, he's not just handing things out. But when we have this certain level of social mobility, a lot of people are growing together, but the perception changes a lot. So like a regular middle class person could have access to more things, but now she's seeing her housekeeper also have access to more things. So the gap is not the same as she thought it was before. So like this idea of like there's some certain levels of inequality that belong in this society that was getting challenged by these social policies, and that created some level of resentment from a middle class and upper classes in Brazil that were very accustomed to certain colonial traditions, primarily when we look into like caretaking, like as one of the main fields, so like this tradition of like slavery in Brazil, and like having a housekeeper live in your house and do things for you at 3 a.m. if you want them to, and not be able to do that because now there's a law that is probably going to properly regulating their jobs. And the one person in Congress that voted against that law was Bolsonaro in the past. So there's this level of resentment. They're able to grow on this, and when Bolsonaro goes through, you know, the terrible management of the pandemic, but there was purpose in that for him as well. We thought, okay, maybe humanity is winning. You know, people are like solidarity. The pandemic has impacted. People saw how bad things are, but no, we still have these issues with anti-communism, anti-leftism, this fear of the left, the moral panics. Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, like the whole thing, and then they started doing Chile as well because Boric won in Chile, and they just kept going with this, and at the same time importing and creating new techniques for creating, well, we even said, I'm just going to finish this part with this, that fake news are sort of a thing in the past now, because what they started doing is just like creating this like misinformation chaos to the point that you don't even know where the information is coming from anymore. And if you do something about it, for example, this pastor in Brazil who said he actually posted a video online reading something that he said was a court order for him to apologize to Lula. And then he starts reading it, and as he's reading the court order, he's apologizing, but he's not. Like, he's saying things about Lula at the same time. And he's playing the victim, being forced by the oppressors in the electoral Supreme Court to do this. And then we find out that it was a complete lie. So he was served to be in court at some point because of the things that he had been saying, but there was no court order for him to do anything. He wasn't sentenced to do anything. So he actually manipulated information, and he actually lied about official documents, which is a crime. Right? It's like he created a fake document and read the fake document using the name of the minister from the electoral Supreme Court and everything. And then people are like, "See, that's absurd. He must be arrested." But then if he gets arrested, he also wanted that. Because if you get arrested, then if it services the narrative of being persecuted for being different, for being Bolsonaro, or for being a Christian. And the role of like this fundamentalist evangelicalism in Brazil is very strong in those terms. It played like a very intense role, not just in terms of the ideological conservatism, but the role of these leaders as well in campaigning for Bolsonaro.
This, I think, is one of the reasons why Lula's victory, among several reasons, but why it's really an important victory internationally, right? I mean, we all care in this room and watching online presumably about Brazil and about Lula's victory because we're internationalists. We understand the significance of these victories across borders. But like, why should ordinary people care about what's going on in Brazil? I think part of what Lula's victory was able to demonstrate in this context that Sabrina was just describing here, of an increasingly virulent, sort of evangelical right, of this coalition on the right, of this, sort of the center to the far right, is that this is one of the first major victories of pushing back against that rising tide. Now, people might say Biden in this country against Trump, but that's, I mean, maybe that's better to say for the Q&A, the differences between Biden's campaign and then Lula's campaign. But I think Lula, part of what he is able to do, I would argue uniquely in Brazilian political culture, is to sort of link his position on the political stage, rightly or wrongly, with millions of voters who otherwise feel, that the political system in Brazil doesn't really care about them or doesn't really consider their interests. I mean, Lula's favorability, his connection with the poorest voters of Brazil is really remarkable. I mean, it's really stable and it's really durable. As we were saying, Lula, went to jail. The PT, was at its lowest point a few years ago, and yet, despite Bolsonaro's attempts to sort of out social policy or give more money than the PT did to the poorest people, playing into the argument that these people will just vote for whoever gives the money. No, that in fact, there is a real connection there between Lula and the PT and these voters that I think ought to be instructive of how you build durable, whatever one wants to call it in the PT's case, progressive, leftist, sort of center-left coalitions that stand the test of time, right? Because in this country, and I keep coming back to this country because tomorrow, of course, there's an election, and we'll see how the Democrats are going to do. But this idea that, working people need to be part of a winning political project, they need to be valorized, they need to be, communicated with sort of directly. And if nothing else, the PT, I think, relearned that lesson. It's a lesson that the PT sort of understood better than any political party in its early years, but that might have become less immediate to the party when it was in power from 2003 to 2016. This idea that there's a vast popular base in Brazil that is not represented in power, and that the role of the PT is or should be to channel that politically. And Lula, through his sheer sort of political skill and his own life story, which is also, I often tell sort of people who hate Lula, right, that whether you like him or not, one should be, I think, proud that something like that was possible in Brazil, right? A person who is not part of a political family, who's not part of any kind of long-standing political plan, to rise to the presidency. And you often hear even begrudging respect from people who otherwise hate him say, yeah, okay, the guy's good, sort of politically talented. And I think for this moment that we're coming out of post-Bolsonaro, I can't imagine anyone who would have, Brazil's is in a bad way right now, right? Financially, sort of on the world stage, all kinds of real big challenges. And then, Lula, and I wonder how Sabrina feels about this, but I'm of two minds. On one hand, I don't think it's healthy for the left in Brazil, for a democratic culture to rely as intensely as it does on the single figure, on one man, as it does. On the other hand, as I was just saying, there's a reason why Lula is Lula, right? There's a reason why after losing an election, he loses 3 times before he finally wins. And every time he lost, what did he do? He didn't contest and say, well, let's block the highways. Maybe that was justified perhaps in some occasions. But no, every time he lost throughout the 90s, go back to the masses, listen. He would do these big events where he would listen to people and find out sort of what works, how to connect, and most importantly, show up, right? Just to be there in an off year that wasn't an election year. That I think is really instructive. But the point I was trying to make is that now that he's won, there's a real challenge to understand sort of what kind of government this is going to be. And one thing I've had to resist kind of laughing is there are already demands for him to make gestures towards the right. Well, what kind of Lula is this going to be? Is this going to be the radical Lula of the late 70s, early 80s? Is it going to be the moderate Lula of the early 2000s? What he should do is he should make a grand gesture to the center and take all of, issue X, Y, and Z off the table. That would pacify the country. That's what he needs to do, a big gesture to the center right. The problem is, from my point of view, is that he has made almost nothing but those gestures throughout the campaign to signal precisely that this is not a left-wing candidacy per se, but that it's a broad front candidacy. And so maybe we can all talk about this in the Q&A, but it's like...
that was one of the conflicts that we had, right? Because Lula kept going to the press and saying, this is not a left-wing campaign, this is a democratic campaign for the good of the country. And then we had to go like, yeah, but the program that the coalition delivered is actually left-wing. The actual things that are like in writing, that got registered, that many times Lula wouldn't even cite things that were in the program, so that drove us nuts because one of the tropes that Bolsonaro began employing was saying that, well, Lula has no program, he has no proposals, there's nothing. And
just personality.
Just personality, just him, and he says, and he only talks about the past. And that was very unnerving because he would go on the debates and there's like this one Lula line that he uses a lot, right? Never before in the history of the country did the farmers make as much money as they did under my government. Did people have so much to eat? And it always became a thing. Like it could be even like a drinking game when you go to a debate, and then Lula would be like, never before in the history of the country, like you drink. And then, but you also need to talk about the future, because just going backwards and saying, well, I help to lift people out of poverty and out of hunger. This is quite important considering that Brazil is in a deep state of hunger right now. Food insecurity is something that affects half of the population. So we're talking about more than 100 million people in some level of food insecurity, meaning that they have to choose whether they're going to pay a bill or buy some medicine or take the bus or buy food, right? And Lula has great proposals. Like from the beginning of the year, I was in meetings where he was talking about with nutritionists, with people from family agriculture, with former ministers and secretaries that worked with him on fighting hunger. Amazing, but it's also different context for hunger in Brazil today. In fact, dealing with crops and the production, agricultural production in Brazil today means dealing with the impact of the ecocide that Bolsonaro left in all of the biomes, not just in the Amazon. So there's a lot to it, and it was hard sometimes to get it across because he would either be talking about the past or making this appeal that we're very broad here. We're taking everyone here that's against Bolsonaro. And that created challenges for us and opened up gaps for the Bolsonaro campaign to claim things about Lula's true proposals, and then we spent the past 2 months basically just, okay, it wasn't like this, it is like that. And the second round was especially tough because this is when Lula opened up even more. So then there came the letter to the evangelicals, and then there was a new letter to the Brazil of the future, the Brazil of tomorrow, and that letter had elements of proposals that were good, but in the end it's like, okay, yeah, but fiscal responsibility, yes, we're not going to go we're not going to overspend, but at the same time we need to take away this ceiling that they put on social spending in the country to be able to do anything, because Bolsonaro left the country with absolutely no resources in the budget. So we have no money to build kindergartens, We have no money for like the popular drugstore system, getting drugs more accessible to people. We have no money even like for things that Bolsonaro's famous for, but like public security. Like he slashed things across the board. And this is the budget for 2023. And like Lula has the challenge of arriving with an approval rating that's going to be hard to keep high, because it was already very polarized. So we're coming into a situation that he won by a small margin. So that means that he might get like a decent approval rating in the beginning, but it's not going to be that high either. And we're going to see a drop. That's something that's going to happen. It happened to Boric in Chile. It's happening to Petro in Colombia, and Petro was able to maintain okay for about 2 months, and then it just started dropping again. So like the approval rating is going to drop, and then there's going to be this push to, okay, so what didn't you promise this? Wasn't your campaign based on Brazil being happy again? And the pressure is going to be to give more up, to make more deals. So maybe the press will take it easier, so maybe the financial institutions will take it easier as well. But we're at this point that we don't even know what else is left to give. Like part of the reason that Lula won is because this one candidate from the center right, Simone Tebet, who did quite well. She's a senator. She got sort of well known in the country for being very like well spoken during the pandemic as well, denouncing things that came out of the Bolsonaro government. But her record is of voting with the Bolsonaro government together. Her record is anti-indigenous. Her record is pro-agribusiness. But she did so well, and she came in. She was in the third place. That her helping Lula, we know that made a difference in terms of the numbers. Like we have a breakdown of this, and now she's really well positioned to basically get any ministry she wants, and we know she wants the presidency. And this vacuum of like not having another name that's close to Lula's and relying so much on this one personality that I think was necessary now, because this is what we had. So like back in January, like my first video and editorial also, so like both for Tese 11 and for Jacobin in the year was about, Lula is the candidate and the left should be behind him. Like that we had time to try to build something else. Didn't work. This is what we have now.
You got pushback for that.
Yes, like I all of a sudden I wasn't a Marxist anymore. So, but that was the point, because we were basically wasting resources trying to fight over that. And the earlier on that we were with Lula, the more we were able to actually influence that first program. Like I helped to coordinate the program with PSOL for the environmental issues. So it was important to be with him from the beginning, in the meetings, following up on things. But we know right now that the left basically has nothing to offer in terms of an alternative name for the next 4 years. Even Guilherme Boulos, who he did quite well, like he was elected. Guilherme Boulos is the coordinator of the homeless workers movement in Brazil. He ran in 2018 as a presidential candidate for the smaller Socialism and Freedom Party. And he got elected now as a federal congressman, more than 1 million votes in the state of São Paulo alone. Maybe might get a ministry as well, but it's not a name, nothing close to the name that Lula has. But Simone Tebet, the center-right woman, she's building up to it. And my big fear then that I guess like it's good that like, this is going to be registered. Let's see how that plays out in a couple of years. But my big fear is that Bolsonarismo is not defeated. Like Bolsonaro is out, but the Brazilian, this new right, continues to play into the fears of people, the ideology. They have control of Congress basically. They continue. And then we are turning so much into like making concessions to the right and to the right to the right. Then in 4 years, Simone Tebet is the Democratic candidate, and the left has nothing else to offer.
Because I think everyone in this room, again, if you're here, it's because you agree that holding power isn't just about damage control, right? That it should be about advancing these larger fights. So on one specific issue, for example, that I think we've seen Lula see again and again and again is on the issue of abortion, for example. Whereas much of the rest of Latin America is moving towards a kind of, I think, common sense policy about abortion being part of medicine, being part of women's, health care. And he said as much as recently, just a few months ago, that it should be treated as a matter of public health. Abortion is illegal in Brazil in all cases except for rape or incest, or for the life of the mother, the health of the mother.
But even so, it's hard to get it. Like, it's the minister for women and human rights under Bolsonaro actually tried to get in the way of, for example, a 10-year-old girl who was pregnant, who was raped and that are pregnant, getting in the way of her getting an abortion. Like, so like the Bolsonaro government tried to, like, it was really into suppressing the rights of abortion even in the legal situations.
Even when you can, right,
Yeah.
right. And then by the time that the voting actually began, the final debates, Lula had completely backed off. So no, I'm against abortion. I'm a family man. If anything, Bolsonaro had once supported the morning after pill. He's the actual, one in favor. And I found that to be kind of a disappointing, sort of concession. But this is why it really pisses me off, frankly, that this idea that Lula hasn't even taken office yet, and it's all about what concessions is he going to make. And I think it's really about limiting his ambitions, right? Limiting, as Sabrina was saying, that there are some really good new ideas that they basically have ready to go, that they can.
I was the crazy person in the campaign that people will be talking about all random things like, no, but there's this one part in the program here that's amazing.
Yeah.
Hear me out, please.
It's not true that he doesn't have a platform.
Yes.
Because in Brazil, you actually have to register your platform.
Yes.
Which you have to you have to write out what you intend to do, and obviously whether you do it or not is a different question. But you have to kind of formalize your platform.
There are 121 items, and I went live on Twitch, and like I'm streaming reading the items for people, and like, so yes, there is a proposal for this. There is a proposal. That one is not a very good proposal. We need, like the stuff on the war on drugs is terrible. But like there's like some stuff that's good there, and we should be talking to people about it. In the end, like we still ended up in this situation that part of the people are campaigning on just like we need to get rid of Bolsonaro, Lula's the savior, and we were thinking, yeah, but we can't give up on politicizing this campaign. We can still talk about the issues and people's demands. And in the second round, we were able to talk to like women who are like evangelical and conservative, who are not that into Bolsonaro, because Bolsonaro also reminds them of like their terrible sexist husbands, right? So they might not want to go Bolsonaro, but they're afraid of Lula and things like that. So but let's talk about healthcare and education for children, and what does it mean to have public Wi-Fi in your neighborhood, and those things resonated with them. And so this notion that we can just make the campaign based on like fighting the fake news and just pointing the finger to the other side and not bringing down to the issues is it's a wrong notion. We still, even in that really tight space of when you're just fighting for a vote and you're not sleeping and you're anxious all the time, it's still possible to make it about the issues. And I think we need to maintain and increase this in the next years.
It's a very different context, right? But the PT, I mentioned that the PT is this incredibly durable political party. Well, its formative years, it's all about policy. It's all about, yes, Lula as a figure, but it's all about these kind of material concerns of daycare for the children of working people, for example, right? It's about fighting against wage suppression in the federal government that's eating away at the purchasing power of working people. And this is one of the challenges of the PT when it was in power last time, and I think this time as well, which is how to translate a kind of militancy, which I know will be a dirty word in the government in Brasilia this time, but the kind of militancy that made the PT this enduring force that it is, translating that into a governing strategy, given that the PT does not have a congressional majority. It's going to have to make deals and concessions that none of us would love, none of us would choose to make enter into these agreements that he's going to have to enter into. and as Sabrina was saying, I think it's going to lead to some political erosion. We're all kind of on this high that Bolsonaro's gone, but there's going to be a lot of disappointment that we have to swallow. And of course, by all means, we will absolutely do so, you know, considering the alternative. But I agree with Sabrina that, you know, right now we're in a pretty positive, optimistic place. But, you know, 4 years, 8 years, the next few elections, Bolsonarismo is not going anywhere, right? To me, the story of the first round of the vote, because right, there's the first round, there's several candidates, the top two finishers, if no one gets over 50%, go to a runoff. Well, the story to me of that first round was of the power of Bolsonaro's coattails. That there were several governors races that looked like would be close between a Bolsonaro candidate and a either center or center-left candidate. It wasn't at all. I mean, just these prominent, you know, figures. In Rio de Janeiro, Marcelo Freixo, a guy who, you know, had been almost elected mayor and almost elected governor, and was just wiped out by a Bolsonarista candidate, which was incredibly disappointing.
In the campaign that he made a lot of concessions to the right.
Exactly. Playing the same playbook, and it didn't work. And so, you know, Bolsonaro has been defeated, but there are all these new candidates, former ministers in his cabinet, you know, really kind of batshit, kind of scary people who will have kind of safe, probably most likely safe positions. His son's in elected office. And Lula was able, I think, to deliver this victory. I agree that I'm not sure anybody else could have. But one also wonders, one thing to watch is to what extent he is able, willing, interested in directly dismantling this broader apparatus of Bolsonarismo in a way to recover a kind of, big quotes, more normal kind of politics in Brazil, right? I mean, it's often said that the biggest legacy, the greatest legacy of Lula's immediate predecessor, Fernandes Cardoso, who was a former Marxist economist, Marxist sociologist, who became a neoliberal and kind of a Clintonian president in Brazil. One of his great achievements, it's often said, was to tame the right? That he brought Brazil's dictatorial far right into a kind of center-right coalition that completely falls apart. That is now dominated by the Bolsonarista, far, you know, kind of radical, sort of, you know, red in the face, violent, you know, far right. And I think this will be one of the existential challenges for Brazilian democracy and for a new Lula administration is what to do about that, because it's not going anywhere. So more, or if you want to turn to questions.
Maybe just to wrap this up, we do have a plan for like a transition to the new government right now. So let's just bring this to like this week, basically, right? As soon as we got the electoral results, these more radical extremist Bolsonaristas didn't accept it. They started blockading the roads. I almost didn't make it out of the country because they were blockading the road to the airport.
A lot of flights canceled.
Flights canceled, and it was a nightmare. Like, people didn't get to chemotherapy. There was a heart that didn't make it to its donor, or from the donor to the new transplant. So like it created havoc throughout the country, partly because the highway police wasn't doing its job to getting them out. It was actually supporting them. We have videos, for example, of like highway police officers actually cutting fences together with the Bolsonaristas to get access to the airport roads. So there's this whole situation. At the same time, the Brazilian Electoral Supreme Court is issuing certain orders for accounts that propagated a lot of fake news. So there have been like accounts suspended temporarily on Twitter, and now the Bolsonaristas are complaining to Elon Musk, who's saying, I'll look into that, right? So that is, let's not forget Elon Musk, who said about Bolivia, we will cool whoever we want, right? And this is happening, still ongoing, but we had this fear that because Bolsonaro never actually went and publicly conceded defeat. Never did. He he didn't say anything on Sunday. Nobody knew where he was. We thought probably crying in the bathroom, hopefully. And then nothing on Monday, and then on Tuesday he finally makes a statement. When he makes a statement, it's less than 2 minutes. He doesn't really concede defeat. He only tells people not to be like blocking the roads in a violent way and things like that.
Not to embrace the tactics of the left.
Not to embrace the tactics of the left, so he throws it back on the left again. So then we end up like 24 hours explaining the difference between like blockading a road because you're fighting eviction and just doing that because you're claiming electoral fraud when there wasn't any. And that's been going on, but we know that these people are not going anywhere. They've gone through that stage in conspiracy theory where a lot of them, we can't reach them anymore. And I think in the US, you guys are very familiar with this and like the effects of QAnon and all of that in people's consciousness. So there is a percentage of society that I'd say we can't really reach them with ideas anymore, but hopefully we can make their lives better if they're working class, and that might have some impact of some level of normality. And even though Bolsonaro hasn't conceded, we do like there are people in his government working with people from Lula's team to create like the new transition period into Lula's inauguration on January 1st. Bolsonaro, however, said he will not be in the country for the inauguration. He doesn't want to pass the ribbon on to Lula. But another reason he might not want to be in the country is because once Bolsonaro is no longer president, it's easy to go after him for his crimes, and there are already several cases against him in court. So this is something that we're not sure how far that's going to go. We're not very good at actually accountability against people like Bolsonaro and the military dictatorship. Like we had, I think amnesty was probably something that we're still reaping the terrible results of amnesty for torturers in the Brazilian dictatorship. But I hope that something can get done in that sense, because Bolsonaro is actually being denounced even in international courts. So yeah, maybe
we'll open it up. Yeah.
Questions from the audience? Yeah.
I'll just say we'll ask the panel to repeat, or I can repeat. So I'm controlling the video and just want to make sure everybody in the online audience will be able to hear.
Okay.
So don't be surprised if you hear questions twice. Second, I'm getting questions and comments from online, and so I'll read them out as they come in.
Sounds good. All right, let's start. If we have anybody here, y'all will get first cut, and then if not, we'll go to the online audience. Yeah, back here.
Hi Sabrina, I'm a huge fan. I'm from Brazil as well.
Hi.
My name is Paula. I've been living here for the last 3 years, and it's. Can you hear me well? Yes. It's very common to draw parallels between United States and Brazil politics. Studying the evangelical history, that when they went to Brazil, it was like based church from the United States and Brazil, but you don't see as many evangelical politics here in the United States, right? And in Brazil, it's kind of like an epidemic where all the pastors are deeply involved in politics. And one of the hugest fake news against Lula was that he was going to close the churches and everything. And we know that this is not true because he was the person that signed the law
For religious liberty, yeah.
Exactly. Thank you. But do you think there is some kind of strategy that the left can make to avoid this deeply involvement, that it's completely attached to Bolsonaro? Bolsonaro kind of got that evangelical group that we know that not all evangelicals are the same, but we know that mainly the leaders are supporting him in large.
Yeah. So just to repeat a little bit, the question is on the role of the evangelicals going forward now, because the evangelical crowd in Brazil is not just right-wing. There are some gaps in there. And the pastors played a huge role right now, but in fact, Lula had to appeal to these evangelical crowds now, right? So to discuss a little bit in that sense, right? Do you want to give a little bit of background? Like actually one of the pieces that I commissioned from André a long time ago is this profile on Silas Malafaia, and he's done more research ever since on this connection between like televangelism and
Yeah, I'm just going to share this with David later. I have a piece coming out next year in an academic article that was also came out in Jacobin that really looks at this key figure, Silas Malafaia, who is one of the largest neo-Pentecostal pastors in Brazil, who makes a kind of interesting transformation from being sort of apolitical in the sort of throughout the 90s into the early 2000s. He appears with Lula during Lula's first campaign and says that pastors should not be picking candidates that were not in that role, to being pretty close with Lula and then Dilma, and then completely, abandoning any kind of connection with any progressive politician and saying not only that the left is not representing evangelicals, but that they're evil, that they're the devil, that you cannot, no evangelical can vote for a left-wing candidate. There was a moment there, right after Bolsonaro lost, that Malafaia said, he lost, right? If you're going to allege fraud, buddy, I want to see proof that he lost, opening perhaps a door with Lula the PT, but he's already kind of gone back on that. Now he's saying that, it's on the electoral authorities to show that there wasn't fraud, suggesting, to your point, I think, that there's now a situation where maybe the faithful are leading the leaders, right? That if there's no concession among people who are voting for Bolsonaro, maybe there's a kind of power reversal here in which the leaders don't want to lose the faithful who, as Sabrina was saying earlier, might be lost to any kind of rational kind of argument. And the last thing I'll say before I let Sabrina talk is, I think in this country we've come to take for granted the role of evangelicals in politics because it's not sort of new anymore, right? The Reagan Revolution, in the 80s, of course, evangelicals emerged as a real powerful political force, and I think it's happening in Brazil. It's been delayed, but it's been slowly growing the influence of evangelicals, especially Pentecostals, as a denomination for decades. But it's reaching now this point where there's still a minority religiously, that Catholics remain the largest Christian group in the country, but more and more they're able to vote, sort of in a block and sway elections. And so in 2018, 2022, Bolsonaro won overwhelmingly with evangelicals, whereas Haddad and Lula, I think it's true of Lula, I have to check the numbers, won narrowly among Catholics. In other words, the victories of Bolsonaro owe a large part to evangelicals, and it doesn't seem like they're ready to abandon him even though he lost.
But something that did happen this time around was that the left is finally having a different approach to the fact that, well, there are people who are working class who are evangelical. And we need to reach them in some way, in spite of what their leadership is saying, in spite of them associating themselves with like sometimes conservative thinking. And part of this comes with understanding the terrain, that you have progressive and left-wing people in the evangelical crowd, and they have actually been persecuted by their own through the past years. I've been doing some work on this more on the organizing side, not on the research side. I grew up in one of those neo-Pentecostal churches. I remember being 5 years old and following Silas Malafaia around the city with my mom and things like that. So up until I was 18, in my hometown of Goiânia, which is one of the most conservative towns in the country, it was very much part of that thinking that, well, the pastor is an authority over your life, and if the pastor is saying that other person is also an authority, you gotta respect. So sometimes people vote in a certain direction, and not for like complete association and belonging in that camp, but from the sense of authority. That, and Damaris Alves, former Minister of Bolsonaro and now elected senator for the federal district, actually said, well, this is not an election, this is spiritual warfare. And people take that very seriously. They take that very seriously. But the Lula campaign, the past months, even before the official campaign began, started seeking out, trying to understand who are the progressive leaders here, and bringing them into conversation, seeing how they could be supported as well. We had, for example, Henrique Vieira, who's very from the Socialism and Freedom Party congressman now. He got elected from the state of Rio de Janeiro, and he's a pastor. right? So there, some of like this is starting to get. I'm not gonna say it's not getting even, because we still have a long way to go. But breaking the narrative that you can't be Christian and vote left, I think this is something that we were able to make so much that André Valadão, who was one of the main evangelical leaders, famous for saying like, no, you're not a Christian if you're leftist. Leonardo Gonçalves, who's a friend of mine, Christian singer in Brazil, he actually rescued a video from André Valadão in the past, saying that no, you can't be leftist and Christian. There's no problem with that. So they're feeling this pressure themselves now because the narrative is not so homogeneous in their own camps. So they're either going to give into the more extreme base that's going with Bolsonaro, or they'll have to moderate themselves, which will give us room again to say that we're pro-religious freedom. And yes, if you identify as an evangelical, yes, you can vote Workers' Party. Yes, you can be organized in your labor union. You can be in the social movement. And this also requires understanding the role that some of these leaders have played in very poor communities in the past years. Because it's not just about religion in the sense of coming here and giving spiritual guidance. When you go through economic crisis and austerity in the way that we've gone through since before the coup, actually, because Dilma was already starting to implement some neoliberal cuts, and the crisis was already coming. Some of these leaders were also there, like responsible for charity, making sure that food would reach people's tables. So they have this connection. So this level of social infrastructure needs to be better understood, so that perhaps we can let the spiritual leaders be spiritual leaders, and the actual socialist organizations can play a role. And here I'm being very optimistic. The socialist organizations can play the proper role of being with people when people need them the most.
Yeah, I have a question myself, and so I think it was Andrea, you talked about dismantling the apparatus of Bolsonarismo, and was just curious, what would that involve? Because here in the U.S., the Democrats don't exactly attack the Republican base very much. There's some anti-jet ski dealership legislation, but it was kind of curious, like when you talk about what can Lula do in the next 4 years to kind of undermine the far-right base and actually create more breathing room for left, not have another Bolsonaro come around, what would that actually look like in terms of what he can do or should do?
So should I restate the question? For the camera?
Sure.
Yeah. So the question is how to dismantle the sort of the apparatus of Bolsonarismo in the next 4 years to prevent either the return of Bolsonaro himself or the election of someone, like him, one of his sons perhaps. And I think it's important to remember a point Sabrina made, which is that Bolsonarismo is a coalition, and so there's no kind of one thing that can be done. I think one of the major goals, that's I think a national kind of an emergency for a new Lula administration, though, is to meet the material needs of the vast majority of the Brazilian population. That is, people who are either in a sort of precarious position, who are literally struggling to feed themselves and their family, or who are on sort of the cusp, right? People who are looking for a political project, or at least are looking for solutions. People for whom an argument of, it's not left or right, it's forward, these kind of empty political slogans might appeal, because people, at the end of the day, people want their basic needs met: public transportation, education for their kids. And I think, part of the PT's challenge now that it's back in power is to deliver on all of these fronts. And it sounds like this incredibly, difficult task, because it is. But this is why Lula talks so much about his record, as Sabrina was saying during the campaign, because there are a lot of metrics at the PT during his time in power. It doesn't solve all of these problems: public education, mass incarceration. There's a lot of issues one can point to, but it did make a lot of people's lives materially better. And so that's one thing that I think Lula has already recognized as a kind of priority number one. It's why they're negotiated already with Congress an extension of the 600 reais, basically sort of welfare payment to the neediest families, because that's the most important thing, is to keep, this kind of the material needs met for most people. Other than that, defeating Bolsonarismo, I think, will require a willingness to take on really entrenched interests. So, again, one of the issues that got a lot of international attention, deforestation. One of the reasons that deforestation did not, that Bolsonaro did not rein it in is because it was not in his political interest to rein it in, right? His major coalitional partners in agriculture, for example, rely on ever more pastures, ever more, grazing areas for cattle and soy and other kind of plantations. That is not Lula's sort of target demographic. In fact, there were moments during the campaign where I was pretty pleased with how sort of harsh he was being with these really bad actors, right, in Brazil. So I think, taking that on, which will be a difficult challenge because Brazil has relied throughout these years of economic crisis on, commodity exports, soy and meat and all these things. But I think part of what impelled Bolsonarismo in 2018, seemingly sort of out of nowhere, was this new coalition of Western Brazil, kind of the cattle ranches. This is kind of the wild west of Brazil, really growing economically and populationally very quickly. I think Bolsonarismo will continue without a kind of project dealing with this really different political dynamic. It's very different than when Lula, the PT is formed, when Lula governed. This context of sort of big ag. But I think it has to be contended with because it's a power base for a future Bolsonarista challenge. A lot of resources, a lot of money in this lobby, and I think part of what would constitute a successful PT administration now, I don't pretend to have a kind of an idea of what that might look like, but I think you have to tackle some of these forces head on in a confrontational manner, right? Not everything has to be a fight, but I think some things do. Right?
Yes, and there's, because you just went off on the stuff on ecology here, which I think is key to the understanding that Bolsonaro got very isolated in the international panorama because, well, climate denialists and he's killing the Amazon and things like that. That is the narrative on the surface, but we actually know that it is about the economic interest. So when it was interesting for agribusiness to say, yeah, but can we get carbon credits here for not taking away these pieces of forest in our land? Yes, so the government came in and provided a new scheme for that. I actually just published a whole article on challenges around transition, and one of the things that's important to emphasize is that it's very rare for us to have like a purely climate denialist government nowadays. So what we actually have is green capitalism. It is actually what's at play right now in Egypt. It's a Coca-Cola sponsored event in an authoritarian state. So with about 60,000 political prisoners. So green capitalism was already part of the Bolsonaro government. Dismantling these protections was part of a scheme to putting some like financial instruments in place to make sure that you commodify things that you couldn't commodify before because they were protected under certain conservation unit paradigm. So these things are actually going to be carried over into the Lula government. And it's a way for some of these partners to look less aggressive. And that's why Simone Tebet and those people talk about now responsible agribusiness. Not every agro is bad. Like we usually shorten like agribusiness in Brazil to the notion of agro. So like no, not every agro is bad, right? So it's like when we say things about men, it's like not all men. So like not all agro. And like doing like agribusiness, being responsible, being sustainable. That was one of the things that when I was on Twitch, I like reading the programs. Oh, sustainable agribusiness. Somebody mistyped this. What is that? And that's going to be part of the concessions that coming from the beginning, right? But what Lula is planning with this is like this notion that maybe what Fernandes was able to do in the past, but can I tame these guys and say, no, you can't go back to that crowd. Let's stay here. Never before in the history of the country made as much money. Let's make that happen again. It is interesting in terms of stability, but as socialists, for us, we get into the problem of class power again, because it means that they're making more money, they have more capital, they still get to influence politics, and if they change their minds on a whim, we're back to square one. Yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Jordan. Appreciate this event. So this is a little bit of a follow-up from the last question. I feel like in the global north we see the far right really capitalizing on low voter turnout. I mean, we saw this with the first Trump election in the UK, and then most recently with Meloni in Italy. So I'm wondering more about the implications of the level of entrenchment of the far right in Brazil, given that we have this requirement to vote. And I guess the second part of that question is maybe asking to explore a little bit more if, given that the right has Congress in Brazil, what we think is actually can be accomplished in the near term under Lula's administration.
Well, so to that first question, I mean, so one data point that I think is interesting is that this is the first time. So to your point about required voting, this is the first time in a presidential election in Brazil that the abstention rate, that is people who don't vote, dropped from the first round to the second round, which I think speaks to this idea that one of Lula's campaign strategies from the first round to second round was to convince those people that if we can diminish the number of people who, for whatever reason, they don't like either candidate, they don't believe that anything's going to change. If we
For people who didn't vote because they couldn't afford to go vote, right?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Free public transit on the day of the election was like a civil society demand that worked quite well.
In the second round rather than the first, right, exactly. So people could get to the polls more easily, exactly, that's a great point. It diminished the number of people who didn't vote. And so it's, those kind of numbers, when the margins are as relatively close as they were, matter. It's very different in this country where you have to try to boost turnout. If you're the Democrats, you have to really, urge people to the polls. In Brazil, it's mandatory, but it's not like you're going to go to jail if you don't vote, right? There's plenty of people who don't vote.
The fine is what, 50 cents per dollar, depending on the state. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not a huge consequence. So but the challenge then is to, make it so that people feel safe at the polls, right? So one of the concerns in this election was that there are parts, for example, the state of Rio, in which organized crime with links to Bolsonaro or Bolsonaro's family might lead to voter intimidation. People are going to the polls en masse. So knowing that, are there ways for sort of anti-democratic forces to manipulate that? Brazil has a very, and I come back to a point that maybe I didn't make explicitly, but that Brazil has a very good, all things considered, voting system, right? It's, my American friends were like, how do they know the president the night of? Aren't their ballots still pending? Very good at tallying the results, getting it out there, to the point where
Each vote counts.
each vote, exactly, no electoral college, right? It's a simple majority, a popular vote, and to the point where even Bolsonaro allies in the night of the election sort of recognize the validity of the vote. And maybe I'll let Sabrina talk about what's possible in this context, given the range of proposals that have been devised, given this Congress. What's kind of a best case scenario?
Yes. The best case scenario is that even though Bolsonaro's party is the one that drew the most and elected the most people, they want to throw Bolsonaro under the bus. So there are a lot of criminal courts against Bolsonaro. When Lula lifts out because Bolsonaro had a lot of these, he uses secrecy law many times throughout his government to hide particular things. And we say that when you want to mobilize Brazilians, you tell them gossip. So Lula is about to
on the dirt.
a big review. The first week's big review, what was Bolsonaro hiding, right? So in fact, we had this one phenomenon during especially the second round, but throughout the campaign, one particular gossip account, Choquei, like on Twitter and things, campaigning and saying things and getting information before we were getting information.
Really good sources. Yeah.
Yes, like we were quite impressed with that. So we think that a lot of things are going to come to light now, and that might help to create conflict within the far right camp, because they have bad blood within themselves as well. So I think this is something that this is a part where I'm hoping the enemy trips and falls a little, and then there's our part. So in terms of our part, I've been a very strong advocate that if you see an opportunity that you can radicalize a little bit more, just do it. And I think that in terms of getting people's food on the table, we have a lot of good opportunities to be a little bit more, a little bolder in what we propose, because Lula is just, the rationale is right there. So we can gain more ground in terms of pricing policies, crop stocks, how you handle support for family agriculture. There's a lot of stuff that you can throw in right from the beginning that later on might be harder to dismantle. So you gotta take advantage of the moment that people have those things in their minds. And I think Petro gives us a good opportunity to think about that in terms of Colombia, because Gustavo Petro came in a lot more, we have this expression in Brazil, pé na porta, just like with his foot on the door, right? So just come in, it's like, I'm gonna do this and this and this and that, I'm gonna change people in the police, I'm going to take advantage before your approval rate drops. Do certain things, like clean house if necessary. So we're hoping that Lula might be able to do something like that, because we've been hearing whispers. I need to check Choquei to see if it's correct. But we've been hearing things that might be possible. And then once we get into 4 or 5 months into government, we're going to get into the challenges around the spending ceiling. And if we don't remove the spending ceiling, the prospects are really, really bad, because the budget is already a disaster, and we won't be able to actually deliver on things that the Bolsonaristas kept saying, you won't, but he's promising that, he has no money for that. Yeah, we need to find the money for that. So this is the main battle for 2023 is lifting the spending ceiling.
So I'm going to ask one, and then I'll come back to you all. Plus, we have a couple online. But I wanted to ask about my sense in the U.S. is the narrative around how Bolsonaro happened in the first place is corruption. It's like the one word, right? Which you all did mention. But you also mentioned anti-communism. Very much grossly simplifying all the wonderful things you said. But I'm curious to what extent are those the same thing, or connected, or separate? And then how should we understand that corruption? Because I think in the U.S. context, it's very clear to me, often in U.S. politics, going back to at least the Civil War, corruption means delivering any sort of benefits for working class people, particularly working class people of color, even more particularly working class black people. But obviously, it's not exactly the same in this context.
Can I take that?
Yeah. Yeah. I'll try to be a little more brief, because I know that there's a lot of, I think we're kind of getting into it now. I think, so a major part of the corruption as it's sort of wielded against the left in recent years is very much a transnational phenomenon. I mean, it's not exclusive to that, but there's two parts. There's a transnational one that argues that Brazil, under the PT, is in a kind of nefarious alignment with Venezuela, Cuba, now Nicaragua. Basically, every bad actor. They're all leftists, and they're all doing bad things. They're all conspiring against the family. They're all conspiring against religion.
They put these maps out there on Twitter. They show like the red taking over with the hammer and sickle.
Yeah, there was. I heard an audio from a Bolsonaro supporter that right before the election, Brazil is the only country in the hemisphere holding out against the communist menace that Joe Biden's a communist. These really kind of fanciful notions. So that's one aspect of it. Is this kind of international alignment that Brazil would find itself in under the PT, because Lula did emphasize regional integration, right? Support all kinds of financing infrastructure projects in Cuba. And, we've never heard the end of that. What is going on with supporting further dictatorships? That's a part of it. Domestically, there's a sense, among other things, that the PT in power, its main goal, this is the argument, was to perpetuate itself in power forever. As if any political party wants to lose an election. I don't know of any in the world. But no, this is somehow uniquely corrupt, uniquely obsessed with power for the sake of power.
Even people in the left would accuse
Yeah,
the PT
yeah.
from that. So like Ciro Gomes, the like sort of center left, coming from a labor tradition, would be like, yeah, but like PTs like they won't give us room for others to grow. I was like, yeah, but why would they? Right? A political party, they have their own project. You can't depend on them. Like, okay, now it's your turn.
We're
You know?
tired. You
Yeah.
gotta go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it should be noted that in Brazil, this is not a new phenomenon, right? That our friend of ours, Ben Fogel, is working on his dissertation basically on the politics of anti-corruption over the course of the 20th century, and it really, unsurprisingly, crops up at moments of redistributive, in which a redistributive political agenda seems plausible. Whether it's the kind of coalition of the PTB, the Brazilian Labor Party, in the 60s in alliance with the Communist Party and other sort of nationalist forces in the 60s, where it looks like it really might happen, that there really might be a really kind of relatively drastic redistribution. Corruption, corrupt, you know, they're crooks, they're only interested in, they're demagogues, they're populists. It's never the right? The traditional sort of power clans and all that. So it's often used as a cudgel against the left. Again, I would argue in response to a redistributive agenda from forces that don't want redistribution, of course. Yeah.
All right. There's one party in the world that doesn't want to win, and it's the U.S. Democratic Party. Right here.
So I guess you were talking about agribusiness before and how that's one of the main interest groups behind Bolsonaro. Could you speak a little bit more to any of the other larger interests, both behind Bolsonaro and supporting the PT, and both within and outside of Brazil, like any foreign companies or governments especially that have a stake in this election, one way or the other?
Yeah. So this is very key. Bolsonaro got elected with support from the financial sector as well. So there was a lot of pressure from the beginning for deregulation, making sure that you wouldn't tax dividends, and also like creation of like expanding these markets. And that's a good thing for us to understand. Like agribusiness and the financial sector in Brazil, they're almost one and the same. They work very much together, either in terms of making sure you can place these commodities in the futures market and negotiating around the world, but also even making sure that investments in Brazilian agribusiness end up in your pension funds over here, right? And we've been exploring some of these linkages in the past. I did an event with the Progressive International 2 to 3 weeks ago, shortly before the second round, and I was just in Canada last week. I'm starting to lose track of time. So was it yesterday or the week ago? Yes, and we know, for example, that the privatization of this one public utilities company in the state of Rio de Janeiro, in the water utilities, was executed with the help of the business envoy from the Canadian embassy, right? And part of that investment is ending up in the pension funds for teachers in Canada, right? And so if you start digging in the US, you'll find very similar things, but especially tied to agribusiness and even green funds in those areas, because now the agribusiness gets paid not to take away forests. You can package your land as part of a green fund as well. So there's like all the levels of greenwashing. They have all shades of green, right? And then when you look into this, you get, for example, companies tied to fossil capital. So traditional mining, like extractive industries, traditional mining, and oil as well. A lot of pressure. A lot of this had to do with Petrobras. The Brazilian National Oil Company is the one that was used as the main scandal hub, right, for the car wash investigation.
Corruption.
Yeah, so corruption again. Yeah, so like the PT, they lost Petrobras billions, and they left Petrobras with billions in debt, which is really funny because then we were required to explain what it means, like when you have like a large national company, when it borrows to invest, it doesn't borrow pennies, right? It borrows billions, right? So the economy, like Ju Fu, a friend of mine who's a brilliant economist, had to go out and explain like very obvious things again. And then, but Petrobras was very key because Lula, the Workers' Party, even though they were part of this process to like make Petrobras into a mixed capital, open capital, but mixed capital company, always majority belonging to the state, right? So, and there's been this pressure for Bolsonaro to actually privatize Petrobras completely, to have it be a completely private company. They didn't manage to do that, but we knew that if Bolsonaro got reelected, that was going to be one of the first things, because he would come back with a much stronger mandate, more legitimate to do that. But what they did do is sell off a bunch of the assets of Petrobras, including when Petrobras started to invest in renewables. So what happens is that under the Dilma Rousseff government, Petrobras started to invest more in primarily solar and wind, so building solar and wind plants, as part of a diversification approach. Some of them claim today that no, it was like a transition approach of Petrobras. Like it wasn't. It was diversification. Let's just be honest. So yeah, they're expanding the portfolio. You gotta bring in other sources of energy into your energy matrix. Wonderful. And then Bolsonaro started selling them off, including to the Emirates. So there's like the whole thing is like it can't be like they say like, oh, it can be owned by the state, but not our state. We can sell it to other states. Other states, they can buy it. So some of the geopolitical dealings coming from Bolsonaro with other governments had to do with buying off some of these assets as well. And that's one of the challenges now, because, for example, the national energy utilities company, Eletrobras, got privatized along the way. It got privatized in a particular system that you don't have one major shareholder, so like they're all evenly split, but it is still like we lost control of it. So how can the points around energy transition that are part of Lula's program actually be taken forward if we don't have the public utilities company be public anymore? Because that's essential for us to deal with prices, with the expansion, with the integration, making sure that every state is connected to the national energy matrix, which is currently not the case. We still have one state, Roraima, that's not connected. So Lula will have to look into buying back some of the Brazilian assets that Bolsonaro sold off according to the interest of his allies.
You know, Eletrobras was profitable, so it wasn't
Yes.
the argument that it was costing the state. And just to your point really quickly, I would also add, there's a formulation of Bolsonaro's coalition that's become almost cliche, which is the BBB, the bancada of the bullets, bala, boi, biblia, the bullets, Bible, and cattle. Or bull, to keep the bees, I guess.
Yeah.
And so we talked a lot about the kind of the cattle and the ag. We talked about the Bible, the bullet caucus, as it were, right, of public security, arms manufacturers. You know, one of Bolsonaro's main sort of victories that he often talked about was chipping away at Brazil's really stringent arms control legislation. It's very difficult to own a gun in Brazil. Really, only if you're like a hunter or a collector.
It was.
It was,
Yes.
right. And so now there's been this massive uptick in individual private gun ownership that I think it seems like there are signals that one of the priorities for Lula too will be to reassert all the restrictions that previously existed. In that
But there's
regard.
damage that's been done already.
The guns are there, right?
The armed forces, they just stated they have no idea how many guns we have in circulation anymore.
And so that was a big part of the coalition as well that we didn't talk about as much. Yeah. Weapons manufacturers,
Yeah, Taurus, there's,
Taurus,
yeah.
and,
Back row.
Kind of related. So like the highway police, I saw on election day for the second round, did some interference with like access to the ballot and stuff, and then you're mentioning now like sort of the collaboration between them and protesters. So like, what is it that a Lula government should do about that? I'm talking about the Pagliarini, like specifically. And what is it like given the context that they actually can do?
Well, the one thing is like, why isn't the guy arrested yet? So like that's some things need to come before a Lula government, right? So what happened with the head of the highway police is that He was campaigning for Bolsonaro before. He was directly involved in these orders for voter suppression. There was a discussion during the day that it should have they arrested him during the day of the election. That maybe not because it would have been more inflammatory. But then they continue to help with the blockades, and it's going on and on and on, and nothing's happening. And there's like this saying that I actually think I've been trying to track this. I think it comes from Brazilian fortune. That's what's weird about it. But it's nada acontece feijoada. Like in Brazil, nothing happens feijoada. It's like it's a meme. And it's like nothing happens. Nothing happens, right? So we're waiting to see if like around the highway police, something should happen before Lula comes in. So things don't look like it's just like Lula changing the names and doing that level of intervention. On the other hand, this gets into a whole problem with Brazilian police in general. Like, because the Bolsonarismo is not something that arrived at the Brazilian police institutions. It emerged with the help of the Brazilian police institutions. So is that Lula talked in the program about restructuring the pay for the police, the more focus on like civilian police rather than the military police and things like that. But then obviously we're going to run into other issues around, well, what is police reform in a country that kills so many people, right? And then we get into the same debates that you guys have in the US here around police abolition and yeah, in Brazil we are fighting to get the cameras on the uniforms because the Bolsonaristas are fighting to get the cameras off the uniforms. So then we ended up always in the same little square, right? Not being able to posit anything much beyond that. But I do have an understanding that Lula will have to change names here and there in higher posts. And a lot of this is we're going to find out more like what this means in a pragmatic sense once we find out like Minister of Defense and the new public security as well.
Yeah, like here, right? The president, when he comes to office, when he or she comes to office, is able to make all kinds of appointments. And in the past, one of the things I think to watch out for is the media sort of narrative, right? In the past, when the PT does it, it's aparelhamento, that the PT is putting its people at different levels of government to serve its own interests. This is part of the corruption question that David has too. Another aspect of that is that, well, they control the state. They have people at every level. But then when a bullshit impeachment, trial arises against Dilma, nothing happens. So where is that state control that
Is it the
supposedly was
Cuban
there?
guerrilla fighters that we had everywhere?
Right.
What happened to them?
So
No idea.
it's this sense of, on one hand, yes, the president does have the power to appoint a lot of people, but it's often, in the past, it was kind of a big, almost institutional crisis of the PT, whereas Bolsonaro, every time, for example, the equivalent of the FBI in the state of Rio would look into one of his sons, director's gone, put someone else there, One of their son's good friends is in charge of the federal police in Rio. So, that's a big part of it. Changing the people who are there, and hopefully, as I'm going to make this point earlier about accountability, not for any kind of punitivism, just for the sake of it, but to show that the kind of actions by the head of the Federal Highway Police, guy who was openly campaigning for Bolsonaro, and clearly seemed to have taken part in a coordinated attempt to sway the election.
And openly said he would not obey court orders.
Right, because the court orders were stop these highway operations now, and it didn't stop. Hold people accountable. They need to be held accountable, in some public way. One hopes. Again, not for the mere sake of making an example of kind of here's a Bolsonaro person, we got him, but to indicate that the institutions can't be manipulated in the way that people always said the PT was doing.
Okay, one last question. Maybe it's not that easy to answer, but what do you think is the future of unions in Brazil? The power of the union, because we've been noticing a decrease of engagement in unions, and Lula coming from a union, and also drawing a parallel that I think the union power is growing here in the United States, fortunately. I would like to hear your take on that.
Back in 2018, we're having issues with data blackouts in Brazil around census, so things are a little iffy in terms of comparison, but back in 2018, the last number that I trust, we could say unionization in the labor market in Brazil was around 19%. Very low for a country that, union leaders become presidents, right? So very low. And when we looked into the census data for that and got more and more questions out of it, we found out that like a bunch of these people who were part of this small margin of 19%, they were members of the union so they could access healthcare, or they were members of the union so they could go to the vacation resort. And how many times did you attend, like how many times have you attended an assembly in the past year? 0, right? So even like the data for unionization doesn't really mean organization, right? So you can be a member of a union and actually just the way you subscribe to a magazine. So this is worrisome. And I remember giving workshops to unions on this. It was like, this is bad news. It's already a bad thing, but then we also had this rise in the informal share of the economy. So it comes with the anti-workers reforms under Temer, and then Bolsonaro and his handling of the economy as well. And I think there's quite a big challenge to understand that yes, you can have a government that's going to invest a lot in the formal sector of the economy. So thinking like, how do we create jobs in Brazil that are registered jobs that we call carteira assinada? So we can be creating jobs like that, but it got to a point that then our friend Rodrigo Nunes talks about this in his discussion of Bolsonarismo, that part of the ideological base for this moment that we have is this notion of entrepreneurship, right? So it's based on that, yeah, but I don't want to be regulated that way. I'm barely making ends meet here with my Uber driving, but I don't want to be controlled by the boss. So that creates challenges for okay, I'm going to create a lot of more formal labor, but these people don't want to leave the informal economy into the formal economy. So how do you organize them? So you need to learn to organize people through fragmented means. So it goes back to the question less of the working place, which is usually how we think of organizing in the union sense. So the factory floor, right? Like the workshop. That's the place that we're organizing people, and we're organizing around what is your identity as an informal worker. Delivery workers have been able to do some of that. We always come to Galo comes to mind as one of the main leaders for the delivery people in Brazil. We're yet to make more progress with Uber drivers because they also listen to conservative radio all day long, all day long, so it makes it way tougher. But there are other sectors, and I think a really good bet is to look into the informal economies that we have in the peripheries of the country that work around caretaking and providing for people's regular needs. And there's a discussion around solidarity economies and cooperatives that come from this program that Lula presented that I think can offer a good bridge here for us to think of, okay, how can we organize people as a class so they understand themselves in that way, but it's a little bit more in flux. At the same time, trying to hold off on this expansion of the more informal and precarious economy because we don't want to go in the direction of India where you have over 90% of workers in the informal economy.
Yeah, I don't do too much to add, but just to say that the neoliberal forces in Brazil that backed the impeachment of Dilma's ouster and then aligned with Bolsonaro recognized the need to chip away at organized labor, right? One of the major reforms, Sabrina mentioned, the end of the imposto sindical, which is the kind of the mechanism by which unions funded themselves, right? A mandatory withdrawal from paycheck, basically, to fund the union activities. And it's part of a larger agenda that holds that Brazil has too much protections. That workers in Brazil, formal workers, too many privileges, too many benefits, that it's just
so hard to be an entrepreneur.
It's hard to be an
with all these
employer.
rights.
You
Yeah.
can't fire anybody, right? We heard maybe similar arguments in France under Macron too, trying to chip away at that. And so just understand it as part of a larger, long-term project of, unions are a problem, all of these associated guarantees are a problem, that now these more sort of precarious economic forces, Uber Eats drivers, you know, these kind of food delivery drivers, are recognizing, well, shit, it really sucks not to have these protections, not to have these basic benefits. If you get hit in the street, if you're a delivery person, you're on your own for you know, like workers' comp, things like that. And so this is, I think, one of the real major struggles in Brazil, social challenges in Brazil for the next years, labor. And one's status within this economic model that seems to be in flux, right? That from decades over the course of the 20th century of really solid, influential unions with internal disputes, Lula emerges out of a critical tradition, a tradition that's critical of the long-standing union model inherited from Getúlio Vargas, but that more or less, right, made people, gave them a voice, gave them community, solidarity, gave them, you know, a way to engage in politics, versus this kind of neoliberal free-for-all that we've seen accelerate in recent years in Brazil.
So we've got a related question that I'm going to ask, and maybe it needs to be our last one,
Yeah.
but I'll leave that up to you all. But so, this one of our online questions, how has the relationship between organized labor and the PT institutionally changed over the past couple of decades from Lula's first election to today? To what extent do you think organized labor will be able to effectively serve as a check on the power of the center and the right in Brazil in the coming years?
The thing is that we have right-wing unions in Brazil, right? So like in terms of the union confederations, we had union confederations that actively lobbied and campaigned for the impeachment, right?
Of
So
course.
like they were part of the group, right? And we also have these issue with the confederations that are not so much aligned like with like socialist power and the leftist project, but when particular rights are being attacked, they come and they make themselves present. And so like we had like this rally in Brazil in 2017, under the Temer government. There were like about 100,000 people in Brasilia. That only happened because unions from these other like more moderate spectrum, they also came over and they brought people in, right? But in a sense, we've talked in the past year so much about a general strike, and we never actually make it happen. And it seems to be like that, you know, like the holy grail of organized labor in Brazil, because it's like, okay, there's a general strike in Ecuador, whoa, there's a general strike in France, whoa, and then we keep,
Forgot about it.
forgot about it, but we don't get it. The most that we get is that we get a general work stoppage. We block some roads, and we make sure that like the buses don't leave the station and things like that. Workers won't be able to get to work, so they go back home. So like the day is not going to be as profitable for the employers that day, but you don't really get the level of like picketing and mobilizing that you need to get in order to create a proper general strike. So I think this is one of the challenges. Obviously, what we're dealing with right now is that part of the left is actually afraid of mobilizations under Lula, because they think that if we mobilize under Lula, we're going to be hurting Lula, and then there's going to be another coup, which is what we heard in the past, right? You can't mobilize because you mobilize, there's going to be a coup, and then we didn't mobilize and there was a coup, right? So now we're going back to the same cycle, and what we need to work with, and I think this is something that João Paulo Rodrigues, one of the coordinators of the Landless Workers Movement, he put it that quite well, is that without mobilization, we won't get certain things out of paper, right? They're just going to be on paper forever. So we need to learn to frame mobilizations with the government, mobilizations for things to work, but that depends very much on Lula actually saying those words. I'm calling people to the streets. Congress doesn't want this to happen. Congress is getting in the way. I need the people to stand with us. We need Lula to actually say those words. We need him to be calling on to people, which is something that Dilma acknowledged that the PT should have done in the past. And so it's very hard to think of like what is going to be the role of social movements and organized labor if they're going to be fragmented, afraid that if we take it to the streets, we might be hurting the government. The best way to say we won't be hurting the government is that if the government itself goes out and say let's go together. So in that one matter, I think it's less up to us, and more up to how the people that we just elected handle this. And I hope they've learned the lesson in that sense.
Yeah, there was a historical component to the question too of how this has changed over time. You for my dissertation, I read a lot of sort of left-wing newspapers, left-wing press from the 80s, from the kind of before the PT emerges, so late 70s, early 80s, the years that when it's forming and the years immediately after, and you hear exactly the kind of language that Sabrina was talking about here of like, we need to impose ourselves, right? We need to make ourselves sort of visible and make our demands, felt, right? People in the streets arguing these various demands for childcare, for education, for transportation, and all these things. And the traditional argument is that the closer it got to power, the further away the PT got from that early kind of energy, that early kind of militancy, that early kind of the desire and the optimism that, fuck man, if we organize, we can do this, right? We can impose these major structural changes. And the argument, again, as I say, is that the Lula ran 3 times, I mentioned earlier, and the story is that by the last time, he said, I'm going to run one more time, but this time I want to win. And so, the figures sort of around him sort of helped shed a lot of this impulse of putting people in the street. Not to say that it never happened again after that, but to change the way that you conduct yourself as a party with a real perspective of gaining power, of winning power, and of wielding power. And that realistic approach to power did not involve this kind of thing. And I think, as Sabrina just put it very well, like, that has had a real cost, that approach, right? I think, if anything, it's led the PT away from that energy, the vibrancy that gave it electoral victories in the past, and it's why, at its lowest moment, when Lula was in jail, and PT, in 2018, did not win a single major city mayor's race, or anything like that. And it was in trying to rectify that and to recognize that a course correction was needed that I think we've just seen kind of pay off. That the majority of the Brazilian people were willing to say, we know the PT has kind of stumbled. There's a constant demand for the PT to get on its knees and apologize for all its misdeeds. But I think one of the things that we can take away from this election is that the people kind of know who the PT is. And I mean the people very sort of broadly, but they know what the PT is, they know what it stands for, they know that if they're going to have any kind of influence to pressure this government to make its demands, heard and felt, seen, if anyone's going to respond to people being in the streets, it's a left-wing government. And I think that that's, one of the takeaways of Bolsonaro's defeat is that people, I think, were sick of not having a government that was amenable to that kind of pressure. It's amenable to, don't buy vaccines, don't buy these kind of crazy things. But the real material demands that the vast majority of people need, I think we're looking for a government like the PT that comes out of that tradition and is hopefully ready to re-engage.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much, Sabrina and Andre, for leading this conversation. I also want to thank all the various people that helped us put it on tonight: Kendra, Abel, Taylor, Ashley. I want to thank our hosts at the Institute for Policy Studies and all the people in the chapter that do the back-end work that makes this happen, creating the events, doing the social media, and then lets me just sit up here and take the credit for it. If you're interested in getting involved in future events, if you'd like to get involved in putting them on, any of those sorts of things, you can reach out to us at politicaleducation@ndcdsa.org or on Twitter, at least for the time being, at nightschool_DC. In addition, I wanted to mention that we will be having more events coming up, hopefully very soon, other night schools, but we are co-sponsoring an event coming up with UDC's College of Arts and Sciences, UDC's DC History Lab, History Research Lab, Empower DC, DC Legacy Project, and probably a whole bunch more that I can't remember. Is going to be a film screening for Berry Farm Community Land and Justice in Washington, DC. That's going to be next week, Tuesday, November 15th at 6 at the UDC Theater of the Arts. So hopefully we'll get more information out about that to all of you, but we'd love to see you there. That will also be a hybrid event. So if you can join us in person, that's great. If you can join us online, that's also great. And I think we have one more announcement before we go out, which I will let you switch. You can take my seat.
Hi everyone, my name's Alex. Thanks so much for the great panel and discussion. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Metro DC DSA Internationalism Working Group, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to invite everybody here, even if you're not a member of Metro DC DSA, to join our monthly meeting, which is going to be in about 3 weeks on Sunday, November 27th at 5 p.m. Eastern. Every monthly meeting we have a different political education discussion topic that we start the meeting for like 20-30 minutes to discuss, and we usually start by sending out some articles or like a video beforehand. So our discussion topic for the November 27th meeting is actually going to be Brazil. So one of the resources will be the recording of this night school, and yeah, just find me.
You already have the homework done.
So you guys would be great to contribute, and we'll send a few more articles as well, maybe some that you all have written that you mentioned, and yeah, just find me if you want the link.
Okay, so I think that's it. Have a good night, everyone, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.